My name is Lena Ashworth, and for 6 years, I ran kennel operations for Anchor Station's diplomatic wing, which is a fancy way of saying, I decided who got searched, and my dog decided who got searched twice. Boone was 8 that year, a golden retriever with a gray muzzle and a government file thicker than mine, and on the morning the Halvern Concorde came aboard for their first formal audience with Earth's delegation, he was doing what he always did before a shift, lying across the threshold of the screening bay with his chin on his paws, watching the door like it owed him money. The Concorde sent 41 bodies through that door before the trouble started. Robed attachés, a translator cast with 3 throats each, 2 armored logistics officers who kept their hands folded in a way that read as either prayer or threat, depending on which briefing you'd read, and leading them, close enough to the envoy that he never once looked at anything else, a bodyguard beast the Concorde called a threx, a low, wide animal, built like an anvil with legs, plated along the spine, bred for exactly one purpose. I'd read the intake file on the threx the night before, because Boone couldn't read files himself, and somebody had to know what was walking through that door. Bred on a moon with 3 times Earth gravity, bite force that made the file's author use the word structural. Trained from birth to treat every other living thing in the room as a variable to be managed. It was, on paper, the most dangerous animal that had ever come through my screening bay, and it walked past Boone like Boone was a rug somebody had forgotten to remove. The threx looked at Boone the way a professional looks at an amateur. It didn't growl. It didn't need to. It simply passed him in the doorway, glanced down once, and made a sound low in its chest that I'd have called a laugh if I believed alien throats worked that way. Ceremonial, the envoy said, not unkindly. His name was Tessic Velhan, first overseer of the Halvern Concorde, and he'd clearly been told Earth kept animals for sentiment. We were informed your species keeps companion beasts for tradition. This one seems very tired. He's earned it, I said, and let it go, because Boone had already gone back to his paws, and arguing with a diplomat about my dog's resume 30 seconds into first contact struck me as a bad use of the morning. The screening itself was routine. Boone's real job wasn't the scanners. The scanners caught chemical signatures, weapons-grade alloys, anything with a heat signature it shouldn't have. Boone's job was everything the scanners weren't built for. Nerves. Wrongness. The particular quiet of somebody who has rehearsed being calm. He'd caught 2 smugglers, a defector, and once, memorably, a station engineer having a heart attack 4 minutes before the man himself noticed. He did all of it lying down. For 40 attachés, he did nothing at all. Sat up once to accept a scratch behind the ears from a translator who apparently found the gesture significant. Otherwise, he watched the door the way he always did. Patient, unbothered, a dog doing a job that looked, to anyone who didn't know better, exactly like a dog doing nothing. Then the 41st came through, and Boone stood up. He didn't bark. He didn't stiffen the way handlers train dogs to stiffen in the vids, hackles up, teeth showing, all the theater people expect from a threat response. He crossed the bay at an ordinary walk, sat down directly in front of a junior attaché named Coral Bestain, and looked at the lacquered case under the man's arm, with the same mild, patient attention he gave everything. Then he didn't move. He's clear, said the scanner tech, checking her readout. Case scan negative on everything. Organic courier documents, some kind of ceremonial seal, nothing flagged. Bestain smiled the way you smile at an obstacle you expect to dissolve. Your animal is resting in my path, he said, in the careful, over-formal standard the translation cast used. I have an audience to attend. He does that sometimes, I said, which was true, and also not the whole truth, because in 6 years, I had seen Boone sit down in a doorway exactly 4 times before that morning, and every one of those times, something in the room had been wrong. Overseer Velhan came back to see what had stalled his delegation, and the threx came with him, And the Threx did not laugh this time. It stopped 8 feet back from Boone and lowered its head slightly, the plates along its spine settling flat, in a posture none of my briefings had a name for. "Sergeant," Velhan said, "I would ask you to move your animal. We are already delayed." "I can move him," I said. "He won't want to move. And I've learned to listen to that. I want to be honest about what came next, because it wasn't dramatic. I didn't shout. Boone didn't growl. I crouched down beside him, put a hand flat on his shoulder, and said the only 2 words that mattered. "Sit. Stay." He was already sitting. He stayed. Velhan looked at his attaché, and something in Bestaine's face shifted. Not fear exactly, more the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic very fast. "This is an unacceptable delay for a diplomatic courier," he said, and his voice had gone up half a register, which in standard translation software reads flat, but which I'd learned, after 6 years, to hear anyway. "Then let's resolve it quickly," I said. "Open the case." "I am not required." "You're not required to do anything," I agreed. "And I'm not required to let you pass a dog who has been right 4 times out of 4. Nobody moved for a long moment. Boone sat between us with his tail still, ears forward, watching the case the way he'd watch a bowl about to be filled, not hungry, not alarmed, just entirely, professionally attentive. It was the stillest thing in the room, and it was the thing that decided everyone else's next move. Velhan made the call himself. He nodded once, and 2 of his own logistics officers took the case from Bestaine's hands before the man could object again, and set it on the scanning table, and opened it under lights bright enough to show every seam. Inside, under a false lining that had beaten every chemical and metallic scanner on the station, was a seed charge, a compression device the size of a fist, designed to be primed by proximity to the audience chamber's translation relay, and to unravel every live feed in that chamber into gibberish at the moment the treaty was to be signed. Not a bomb, something quieter and, in its way, worse. Built to make the first contact between our species look like a failure of understanding, a diplomatic collapse nobody could trace to sabotage. Bestaine didn't run. There was nowhere on the station to run to. He simply stood very still while 2 of his own people took him by the arms, and I noticed, in the part of my brain that was still working normally, that he never once looked at Boone. He looked at everyone else. Boone he avoided entirely, the way you avoid looking at a judge who has already reached a verdict. Overseer Velhan crossed the bay himself afterward, which I hadn't expected, and crouched down in front of my dog the way a much smaller man might. The Threx came with him and lowered its head again, further this time, until its jaw nearly touched the floor. "We were told your Earth kept these animals for sentiment," Velhan said quietly. "We do," I said. "That's not the same as keeping them for nothing." He didn't answer that. He put 2 fingers, gently, on the top of Boone's head, the Concord's gesture of acknowledgement between equals, I learned later, not one they extend to animals. And then he straightened, and the delegation went on through to the audience chamber, and the treaty was signed on schedule, and nobody in that room ever knew how close it had come to not being signed at all. Boone slept under the briefing table for most of the ceremony. I checked on him twice. Both times he was exactly where I'd left him, chin on his paws, gray muzzle rising and falling, entirely unbothered by the fact that he'd just kept 2 species from starting their history together on a lie. Nobody thanked him with words, because he wouldn't have understood them, and because that was never really the point. Somebody filled his water bowl before I could, and left it a little fuller than it needed to be. I've always taken that as thanks enough. I filed my report that evening the way I filed every report, in the same flat procedural language the station required. Subject detained, device recovered, screening protocol effective, and none of it said anything about the way the whole bay had gone quiet around one dog sitting still in a doorway, or the way a bodyguard beast bred to answer to nothing had lowered its head to him anyway. Some things don't survive translation into a report. I've stopped trying to make them. The Halvern Concord kept a standing delegation on Anchor Station after that, and in 3 years I never saw the Threx laugh at Boone again. It still walked a half step ahead of the Envoy, still watched every room like a variable to be managed, except for the one dog it had learned, in 8 silent seconds, to leave alone. Boone, for his part, never seemed to notice he'd earned anything. He kept doing the job the way he always had, lying across the threshold, watching the door, waiting for the next person who didn't know how to walk past him.